Hi, everyone. As I said before, some of you came in. It's good to be together at a time like this. So I'm very moved and glad to have this opportunity to talk with you again and to be in it with you. This is not going to be a normal shiur. There's no source sheet. There's no. We will talk about our legacy and our sources and our Torah, but it's going to be a very different kind of journey. Because the truth is that the purpose, as far as I'm concerned, my purpose personally in this conversation right now isn't so much to teach a particular idea, but rather to explore together the new reality we're inhabiting right now and think together. And I prepared some ideas, but I want to hear yours as well. How to be in this reality. So before I open the discussion, I want to share a few thoughts and a few questions that I think in some level shape some of the possibilities of the time we're living in, some of the realities. But I need to start with something painful and shocking. So I apologize, or I shouldn't apologize. This is a reality. I'm sorry for that. This is the stuff of conversation right now. Yesterday, I watched, and maybe you have watched as well, an interview with a woman named Linor Atias. Linor Atias is like Ellie Bear's right-hand woman in Hatzalah. In particular, for many years, she's been one of the heads of Hatzalah's disaster relief team. She's went to, after the earthquake in Morocco, she went to save lives there. After the earthquake in Turkey, she went to save life there. She spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine in the past year and a half. She trained Ukrainian volunteers. Also, there is actually a Hatzalah team, Hatzalah system in Ukraine, believe it or not, where just like in Israel, there's Hatzalah people in various places living their life in Ukraine. And if somebody in Ukraine needs it, they call a number that takes them to an office in Jerusalem that finds the closest person to them in Ukraine and sends it to them. So she was one of the people who were entrusted with building it, setting it up. She's very used to disaster of various sorts, man-made and natural. And she was one of the first teams that went into Be'eri on Simchat Torah, as the situation was still ongoing down south, not after, like in the first day, as soon as anybody could get in, the Hatzalah people got in, still under fire, still with the army and the Kitot Konenut, the first responder groups from every kibbutz and village fighting with live fire in the streets, still with people being held hostages in various places. She was already in there treating people. And I've seen her give interviews before. And she clearly a person who feels things very deeply. And yet now she just cried in live TV. She gave interviews to several people, to CNN and to some other reporters. And she was talking about how horrific the reality she walked into was. And she shared one thing. And again, I apologize for sharing, but I think it's important. I think it's important to know, and I think it's important to talk about it. And there's no kids here, right? We're all adults. She said that one of the houses she got in, everybody was dead except a girl. She couldn't say how old the girl was, somewhere between 8 and 10. And the attackers who murdered her family members, who were lying around on the floor, cut off her hand. And she was sitting there bleeding this whole time for hours until the first responders were able to get in. And she died in Liron's hands. Liron did a tourniquet for her, but it wasn't enough. And Linor started crying as she was sharing, holding this child, trying to save her life as she's shivering and breathing her last breath, and said, I don't understand where evil like this can come from. So I turned off the interview, and I was remembering the last time I heard Linor speak. The last time I heard Linor speak was it's just not very long ago. It's a month and a half ago, but in the Ukrainian Independence Day. It just feels like it was in a different era, a very different era. My father helped organize a party, like a get-together party for supporters of Ukraine to celebrate Ukraine's Independence Day, and also to highlight and celebrate the many, many, many Israeli organizations that volunteered in fighting in Ukraine, supplying medical aid in Ukraine, evacuating refugees from Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So representatives of some of those organizations sat on a stage and shared what they did. And the last to speak was Linor Atias, talking about Hatzalah's work there, about getting various people in various difficult situations from under the fire, literally, all the way to Israel. And at the end, she said something that stayed with me. She said, people ask me why we do it. We're not doing it because they, namely the patients, are Jewish. We don't ask anyone for proof of Judaism when we treat them. We don't say, oh, but was your mother a Jew or was your father a Jew? Or that's not why. We're doing it because we are Jewish. We are Jewish. We are Jews. And when I look at those two moments when I heard her speak, that moment on stage talking about fighting, helping in a faraway place, and that moment yesterday talking about the horror she faced 3.5 weeks ago here in Israel, I thought that this sentence that she said, because we are Jews, could be seen as an answer to two very different questions that have to do with those situations. You could ask, why did these people cut this girl's hand? Why did they leave her to bleed to death after killing and raping and kidnapping her family and neighbors? Why? And the answer is because we are Jews. And that answer stands also for the non-Jews amongst us who was murdered, the Thai workers, the Philippine workers, Bedouin families slaughtered, Palestinian Arabs in the party who were killed, even though they begged and said, oh, but we're Arab, we're Muslim. And the terrorists said, we don't care. So they weren't Jewish, but they were killed because we are, because they're associated with us. They tied their fate to ours, and we are Jews. And this answer, the answer, because we are Jews, is the answer to the question why all of this happened. And it's an answer to a whole slew of similar questions that can be asked in Israel and beyond. Why do we have to hide in our dorms in Cornell while people chant in the corridors from the river to the sea? Because we are Jewish. Why do we have people ripping our Degel Israel from our porch? Because we are Jewish. Why do we have to suddenly defend Israel's right to defend itself? Because we are Jewish. So this is one set of questions that this sentence answers. But at the same time, the same sentence answers the question that Linor herself posited when she spoke in that event that I attended. Why do we fight so hard? Because we are Jewish. Why do we go out of our way to help people? Because we are Jewish. Why, right now, are people abroad collecting money and sending donations and sending tactical gear? It's kind of a bizarre turn of events. People in America collecting tactical gear and sending it to Israel. Why? Because we are Jewish. Why am I, cooking for families in my community where the husband is in reserve duty? Because we are Jewish. This is what it means to me. This is what our values are. This is what our choices to see that we are all in it together and fight for certain values that we all hold dear. Because we are Jewish, because we are Jews. And in the space between the two kind of questions for which this is the answer, namely the question, why do they hate us? Why are we targeted? Why are we killed? And the question, why do we do all the great things we do? Everyone trying hard to help, to be present, to uplift others instead of bringing them down. In the space between these two questions, I think lies the difference or the distinction between the two types of covenant that Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about in his short and very powerful article about redemption. The article called Kol Dodi Dofek, the voice of my dod, my lover, is knocking. The famous quote. I don't know if that's how the book is called in English. Presumably, it has a more poetic name in English. Forgive my in perpetual translation, please. But it's a quote from the Song of Songs, and Rav Soloveitchik used it to write about both the Holocaust and redemption. And he talks about how there's a covenant of fate that we're all part of. In other words, the covenant that means that we're all hated and targeted because for some reason, some incomprehensible reason, people always hate Jews. No matter how hard we try, not everybody, I'm not saying the whole world, but I'm saying there's always been and there always was, and it looks as if there always will be, some special animosity reserved to us. And that creates a covenant of fate because we can live very, very different lives in different corners of the world, and yet we're plagued by the same experiences. Who thought that we would witness a pogrom, an honest-to-goodness pogrom, of a scale the world has never seen in the European pogroms? I'm not talking about the Holocaust, just the proper pogroms before it, on the land of Israel today. And yet here we are experiencing it. And this covenant of fate also explains why when people, and now it's kind of all the masks are off, right? Why people who hate Israel for its supposed mistreatment of the Palestinian carry swastikas in their demonstrations in America. Because that doesn't make sense. If you're saying you're anti-Zionist, why should you carry a swastika? That's just anti-Semitism. They're just hating Jews. And yet, somehow we have this covenant of fate, and you can't really separate. As much as some of us thought that maybe it was separable, it's not separable. We're all in the same covenant. We're all in the same journey in that regard. And that's a heavy burden. But at the same time, there's a different covenant. And that's a covenant of purpose, a covenant of choice. In Hebrew, Ye'ud, destination, but in the sense of like an ennobling destination, the purpose of your journey. And that's a very different kind of covenant, because that's a covenant you have to choose to buy into. You're not just born into it and then carry it like a brand on your flesh or like a yellow star on your clothes. This is a covenant that you choose to enter with your actions, with your choices, with your daily routines. And we are. And that's the other, because we are Jews. Because we are Jews, we choose to do certain things now, all of us, in different ways, all across the globe, because we are Jews. And in doing so, we take our shared faith and we transform it from something that happened to us to something that we are doing, to something that we are choosing, to a way to redeem the world. Not just ourselves, but the world around us, through the values we hold, through the things we believe in. And as we are about to see, we're almost in the shloshim of the massacre. Next Monday night is the shloshim of the massacre. We are no longer in those first few days of shock. I mean, the shock is still here, but it's different. We're no longer in this first 2 weeks of frantically trying to do everything we can, kind of awash with adrenaline and horror. The adrenaline, I think I see it for myself, I see it for the people around me. I can't speak for everybody, of course, but the adrenaline is washing out of our system. It's leaving us tired, and we can't be tired because it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. This is going to be a very, very long time before we are on even ground. And I am not just talking about the war we're fighting in Gaza. I'm talking about grappling with the realities of anti-Semitism being revealed around the world, grappling with the implications of it, finding a way forward. It's going to take us a long time. And we can't just keep running on horror, and we can't keep running on defiance, empowering though defiance is, I think. We need deeper, steadier sources of strength to take all the things we believe in and recommit to them and live them as we reject the idea that their Jewishness is just a matter of fate and instead embrace our shared purposes. And that's what I want to discuss. That's what I want to ask you. I want to ask you, when we make this transition, when we stop focusing, and the first few weeks, I think we were all very focused on our covenant of fate or on what's happened to us, How could it have happened? How terrible it is. Did you hear about this? And did you hear about that? And now there's doing this. And now we found out that. It was just an intense communal experience of mourning and of looking at something that was done to us and trying to come to grips with it. As we switch to looking to what we want to do moving forward, as we're trying to redefine what the covenant of purpose means to us, where do we find the strength for the marathon, for the day in, day out of it all? And I want to open it to you. Would any of you like to share where you feel you find strength right now, these days, as we go through this process? Just unmute yourself and speak up, please. I can go first, but I hope I'm not going to be the only one. I hope you will share, because I think we can all learn from each other. And yes, Sybil, you want to say something?
Yes. I exchanged some texts with a friend who's in Jerusalem, actually just yesterday, and in response to my lame question, how are you? She was very articulate about how awful, in the general sense, she felt that things were. And she ended with, we're engaged in good works. We try our best. Am Yisrael Chai. And she's not it was not something I would have expected to come out of her. She's not a slogan type person.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that what that tells us is that somehow or another, if you take the very, very long range view, we've been around for thousands of years, and we've been through a lot, and we're still here. And so somehow, I think there's some comfort in this long range view that we have this destiny. And that we will somehow prevail because we've all throughout history had the strength to prevail.
I think that's very true, Sybil. Thank you. I think it's very true. And it's very, it was hard in the beginning, right? In the first few days after that attack, it's like, who cares that people overcame a pogrom once and will overcome other things later? Right now we're here, we're in the horror. I think that as we move a little forward, we are starting to see more awareness, more space to think about that. And it reminds me of something my father told me about the time he was a prisoner in the Soviet Gulag. He said that when you think about yourself as an island, right, as an island either in space or in time, you're very weak. You're very weak because you're small, you're a speck, and you're fighting an empire, the whole Soviet empire set against you. So obviously there's strength in knowing that your people stand up for you. So you're not an island in the moment. But more than that, there's strength in knowing that you're part of a long chain. That even if you personally lose, even if you personally die in prison alone, the story continues. There's your personal struggle, but your whole struggle is to be part of something bigger than the self. And he said that as long as survival is a person's highest value, then you're already lost. You're slave to whoever can hold a gun to your head. There has to be something else. There has to be something else that you're fighting for. And when you're fighting for being part of the Jewish people, then you're fighting for something so vast and so long-lived that you can know that no matter what happens to you personally and how hard it is right now, you're part of this greater story. You're part of something bigger. And that gave him a lot of strength. And I find that it gives me strength also to think about it. And I think I already shared with you a little bit about it, but early in the war, I went to the funeral of a sergeant, I think that's how you translate it in English, Sergeant Amitai Tzvi Granot, whose tank was shot up north by Hezbollah. And his father, who's a big rabbi here in Israel, Rav Tamir Granot, he has wonderful Torah. He writes a lot about faith after the Holocaust. His father was a survivor. And he said in the funeral, I lost my private war. I'm a broken man. I lost my private battle. But I fully believe that the Jewish people will win in their battle. And remembering that there is this bigger battle, there is this bigger history. I know I'm elaborating a little bit on what you said, Sybil, but this bigger battle, it just means that what we're experiencing is not senseless pain. It's part of this longer journey. Zena, did you want to share something? It's not working. Okay, so we'll get back to you hopefully if it works. Yes, Diana.
Two things. When October 7th was in October 7th, I immediately thought of Echa. And that's the big picture that you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a service chanting Echa, which is very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
In a very different way, I'm going to say this very briefly, but I'm a writer and I've been working on a colonial, a Hamburg Jew who came to New York when it was British colony.
Mm-hmm.
And I was interested in this man because of his assimilation. I thought he was a story of how a Jew did it, the hiding in the 18th century. I have been unable to work on him now until I redefined the story, and now it's a story of fear.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I want to say.
It's interesting, Diana, because you're tapping into the lamentation aspect of it, the fear, the negative feelings, and that's another thing I've been thinking a lot about, and I've been hearing from a lot of psychologists around me. I talked to several, and I went to several workshops, and everybody says the same thing, which is you have to be present for these feelings too. We can't repress them. We can't just like set them aside. We have to be present. We have to allow ourselves to feel them. The mantra I say to myself every day is like, be present and rise. Be present and rise. Like feel it, but then go up. Don't stay there. And I want to refer to a different biblical moment, not the moment that's depicted in Lamentation, not the moment of destruction. I'm going to talk a different moment for a minute. In the book of Kings, in Kings 2, there's a description in Kings 2 of siege on Samaria, on the city Shomron. And let me just put it in geopolitical context for a second. In the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, as you probably know, unlike in Judea, there wasn't one uninterrupted dynasty. In Judea, they had the Davidic dynasty. In Israel, every few generations, a new dynasty rose. Somebody killed someone or dispossessed someone, and a new dynasty rose, and often also a new capital rose. Very, very unstable political situation. But one of these kings, King Omri, who rose to power, created a very powerful, short-lived, 4 generations dynasty that transformed the northern kingdom from a small, fractious kingdom to one of the powerhouses of the ancient world at that time, of that arena, in that space, that geographical space. We know mostly his son, Achav, who was not exactly a righteous man and who married the princess of Sidon and was known as the king who turned idol worshiping into state religion in the kingdom of Israel, quite literally. So from theological perspective, there's a lot of criticism waged against him. Elijah was his great antagonist. But something that should be said for him and for his father and for his sons is that they had a very strong patriotism. They had a very strong national sense. and they cared about their kingdom, and they cared about their kingdom's strength, and they protected it and stood up for it, to the point that a lot of Zionist rabbis say that we can't learn their religion, but there's something about their sense of national patriotism that is inspiring for us today. And one of these kings, there's a little bit of a machloket on which one it is, so I'm just gonna not name him, but one of the descendants of Achav was the king of the northern kingdom when Aram laid siege on it. And it was a terrible siege, and it looked like everything was lost, and there was no food and no drink, and people were dying in the streets, and it was just terrible siege. It really looked like the end. It looked kind of like what people tell me about the 6 Days War, or what happened before the 6-Day War, rather, when people really were joking in Israel that whoever leaves last should turn off the light, because it felt like the state is about to be wiped off the map, which, thank God, is not our reality now. This is not where we are. But in this reality, we're told in Kings 2 that a woman came and saw the king walking on the walls of the city, on the ramparts, maybe is, I think, the more proper verb noun. And she called out and said, I need you to adjudicate for me. Help me get justice. What's the justice? Me and my friend made a deal. Yesterday we ate my son, and today we were supposed to eat her son, but now she wouldn't give him to me. So please force her to do it. Which is a terrible moment. It's like, wow, how low can you sink? And in that moment, the king tears his clothes in mourning when he hears this story. And the pasuk is very interesting here. Let me share with you for a second the pasuk, okay? Here in Kings 2:6, chapter 6, verse 30. I'm right here. And it came to pass when the king heard the words of the woman, that he rent his clothes, and he passed by upon the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth within upon his flesh. In other words, he is wearing the king's garb over the sackcloth. And there's a question about this passage. Why is it important? Who cares that he's wearing sackcloth? It's not important to the story in any way, shape, or form. The next part of the story moves on to his argument with Elisha, and eventually the salvation that brought relief to the city. It just seems an irrelevant point. And Hanan Porat wrote that maybe the point here is to show that this king is not disconnected. He looks disconnected. He's wearing his golden garb, right? He's wearing a king's garb, but he's mourning with his people. He's suffering with his people. I want to suggest, in light of the events we're living through right now, like literally right now, a different reading or a different interpretive possibility that this reality taught me to look for. Maybe the point isn't that even though he is wearing the king's garbs, he is also wearing a sackcloth underneath, but rather the other way around. That even though he is wearing sackcloth, even though he is present in the pain, in the mourning, in the lamentation, he dons his king's clothes regardless. And I strongly feel that this is a lesson for all of us right now. We need to be present for the lamentation. We need to wear the sackcloth of pain. We need to know what's happening. We need to mourn. We need to be together in it, but we can't stay there. This can't be the only outfit we wear, the outfit of pain and sorrow. We have to also don our strength, our professionalism, our wit, our cleverness, our wisdom. We have to don all our best attribute and do battle. And for some, the battle means wearing a uniform and going to defend Israel, literally in the battlefield. But for most of us here, that's not what it means. What it means is to do battle where we're at, where we can support and uplift and raise and reach out where we can. But it's whatever it is that's our calling right now, we should wear its clothes or its uniform with pride and with strength. So to be present, but also to rise, also to then stand and do. That is what I'm taking from that. Would anyone else like to share their personal experience right now, or their how you get through the day, how you find strength for yourself through the day. Okay, feel free to interrupt me, okay, and share if you want to share as we go on. Just a second. Earlier today, my parents and I went to a Shiva call. We went to attend the Shiva of a soldier who died a few days ago. When they started releasing the names of soldiers who were killed in Gaza, fighting in Gaza, one of the first names that came up was Levi Lifshitz, a young man, very young man from Modi'in. And the name didn't mean anything to me. But then we saw his parents speak to journalists outside of their home, just giving a short message to the public. And we recognized them because the father, I mean, it's Jewish geography, right? My whole family on my parents, me, my sister, and our kids all went to Africa this past summer, again in BC, in a different era. It feels. We went to Africa, and on Shabbat in Zanzibar, we were in Beit Chabad, and we sat next to this nice man with 2 young children from Modi'in, and it was him. This is the father of this soldier. So we said, we have to go. We met this one time. We spent maybe an hour together, but there's a connection. We have to go. And we went, and we asked the father to tell us about his son. And he said that his son was very creative. He was a photographer. He was very kind. He started all kinds of charity activities, and he founded a site to acquire socks for soldiers, warm socks for soldiers for the winter. And he took lots of pictures of his friends and made, kind of printed little booklets for them of pictures of their training together. And he was always looking for what's beautiful. When he had to go into Kfar Aza, in the beginning of the fighting, on October 7th, he called his father and he said, my heart is just breaking for everything I'm seeing here. But he didn't just mean the people. He didn't just mean the tragedy of our murdered brothers and sisters. He said everything. He said the cows that are stumbling here amongst the bodies, the dead bodies, and like, who's going to come and milk them? The dogs that are like lost and don't have a home to be part of. He kept everything that he saw drew his compassion. Yet when it was time, and sorry, I'll rephrase a little bit. So as his sister told us, he was not one of those people who, always want to go to the army, or dying to go to the army, or so ruah. He was not like that. He was a creative person who wanted to create things and see beautiful things and be with friends, and loved people and loved places and loved beautiful nature. And as you can see from his pictures, they're shared online, saw the beauty in people too, and in situations. But he believed, as his sister told us, that this is the right thing to do, and we're fighting for our lives, and his life isn't worth more than anybody else's. So of course he's going to go. If his unit is called to go into Gaza, he's going to go. He's not, a warrior by nature, but he's going to go because this is the right thing to do. And his father said something that really stuck with me. He said that, everybody says, oh, he was so brave. He fought so bravely. It's like, yes, he was brave. And it takes courage to, storm the enemy, knowing that you might pay with your lives. And he was brave. It is courage. But he said, but there's a different kind of courage. And that's the courage that I think is more important, says the father. And my son had this courage. He always had the courage to try new things, to be creative, to live, to make things. And I've been thinking that as we kind of morph from the sprint of the first few weeks to the marathon before us, this is a courage we need. This is a courage we need. We need the courage to live. We need the courage to bring more aspects of who we are into the world. We need the courage to be vulnerable with other people. And this is a very difficult thing to do when you're constantly assaulted by disaster, assaulted by tragedy, assaulted by loss. there's a temptation. There's a temptation to always be sitting with your phone and reading the news and finding out more details and worrying about things that are outside of your control. Unfortunately, I wish they were all in my control and I could just fix them, but that's not the way it is. And yet, like that king, like our ancient king, we have to don more than the mourning. We have to don something else, and that takes courage. That really does take courage. And for me, when I ask myself, and this is the question I started with for you, right? When I ask myself where to find this courage, and I want to be more specific than that and say that the courage, the test is daily. It's not like a courage of now I'm going into battle, so now I need to be brave. No, that courage is a decision that you make every day. Do I get up in the morning? Do I spend that time on my phone, or do I go and look for something else to do, something positive? Do I, cry alone or seek other people to be vulnerable together? It's a constant choice. It's a constant decision that has to be made. And when I thought about where can I find this courage, I thought of 3 instances in King David's life and 1 instance in my father's life that bring me a sense of empowerment. And I want to share them with you. The first is the moment in King David's life when he loses his infant son. If you recall, after David sleeps with Bathsheba and she's pregnant and he sends Uriah to his death, part of the punishment is that the baby that's born out of this union, the union that happened while Bathsheba was someone else's wife, David is told he's going to die. This infant is not going to survive. And the infant is sick, and King David is lying on the floor and fasting and praying for him, and just totally kind of resigning everything else he's supposed to do, just being present and the begging for redemption. And then the baby dies, and he gets up and he washes up and he goes to eat and drink, and his servants are baffled because they were so scared to tell him that the baby died, because they said, oh, he was so distraught while the baby was even alive. How will he respond when the baby dies? Right? And then they ask, like, David sees that something is bothering them. So he's like, what's the problem? They say, why were you so inconsolable when the baby was alive, and now you're acting normal? And he said, now there's no point. He's dead. He's never coming back to me. I will join him. Now I need to focus on life. As long as he was still living, there was hope. So I begged and prayed and did everything I could. But now that he's gone, he's gone. And I find this story very meaningful now. In a way, it always struck me as somewhat cold, honestly. But I find meaning in it now in 2 ways. One, that wherever there is hope, we have to pray and tear the sky with our prayers for our hostages, for the soldiers who are still alive, for our civilians, for our students in American campuses' safety. Where there's still a battle to be fought, we have to be ferocious, both in our relation to the world and in our relation with God. We shouldn't be polite and say, God, would you please? No, we should scream and yell and tear the sky like Hannah did when she wanted a baby. That's the ferocity with which we should pray. We shouldn't care if it looks improper, if it's not the right way to daven, if it sounds too angry. We should tear the sky, demanding a positive outcome. But what is already done is already done. The people who died on October 7th are unfortunately, devastatingly already dead. And we need to move on from that. We can't let ourselves just sink into the mourning and elaborate with ourselves and just dig into all the details of their death. We have to move on. We have to take what we need to take from it in terms of resolve, in terms of our knowledge of who our enemies are and what we're fighting to defend against. And then we really need to move on. Like David, we need to put down the mourning clothes and go on with our daily routines. Daily routines have become an act of courage. How odd is that? Just feeding ourselves and our dependents, our kids, our families, dressing ourselves, doing our jobs. We need to do that because terror, and this was a terror attack on a vast scale, but this was a terror attack, works on breaking people's ability to just go on with their lives. So going on with their lives is important. That's one source of strength for me. Sorry. That's one truth. The other point in King David's life that I find very inspiring right now, and I do apologize, today it's not all coherent. It's just like little points, it's little things, but that's where I'm at myself right now. I'm looking for the lights, and they're not, I don't know yet how they all come together. But the other point in King David's life that I want to talk about is another low moment in his life, also a consequence, even a more distant one, of his situation with Bathsheba. And that is the moment when Avshalom rises against him. His beloved son Absalom leads a rebellion against him. And King David has to run away. He has to leave Jerusalem behind, because he understands that if he tries to stand his ground in Jerusalem, the city will be awash with blood. He can't defend it. So he wants to remove from Jerusalem and take the battle elsewhere. And this is a very low moment, because in many ways, King David brought it on himself. He didn't protest when Amnon, his other son, raped Avshalom's full sister Tamar. He didn't act to reconciliate with Avshalom after Avshalom murdered Amnon, but rather allowed other people to push for a policy of re-inviting Avshalom into the fold. When Avshalom came back, he didn't try to see him. He alienated him. He distanced himself from the affairs of his children to the point that Avshalom felt justified and able to rally enough people around to rebel against his once popular father. And in that moment, as King David is walking out of the city and the people are walking with him and everybody's crying, there's this description of people crying and crying and crying. In that moment, come the priests, the Kohanim, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And David says no. David says the Ark of the Covenant should stay in its place. If I am worthy, if God deems that I am worthy to be king, then I will come back and I will be reunited with the Ark of the Covenant. And if God says I am not worthy, then I will not come back. And there's no reason that the Ark of the Covenant should go with me if I'm not worthy. So the Ark of the Covenant stays in Jerusalem and David leaves. And this moment was always very intriguing to me. And some of you learned this with me before. We learned this passage before, and we focused, we focused on David's cleverness in making a speech that casts his hopeful victory as godly election. He's basically signaling to the people, if I win, it's not just because I'm smarter, wilier, have better soldiers. If I win, it means God wants me to win. So when I come back, you should all accept me as king. And I think there's definitely an element of that. Whenever King David speaks in Tanakh, he has more than one purpose in what he says. There's always several things going on. But right now, in the moment we're at in history, at the moment we're experiencing, with the pain we're living through, when I look at this moment, I see here not just an act of political strategizing. I see here also a moment of dedication. Because King David is saying, I'm dedicating myself to the effort to be worthy. And I don't know if I'll succeed. I might succeed and I might not. I'm not the one who's going to judge if I'm worthy. God will judge if I'm worthy. But I'm dedicating myself to trying. I'm not assuming that I'm worthy and taking the Ark of the Covenant with me. No, I'm dedicating myself to trying to rise to the level where I can be with the Ark of the Covenant. And when I look at the pictures of the young men lost forever from our people, when I was in the house where Levi Lifshitz grew up this morning and looked at his family, a beautiful, loving, creative family who will never be the same. They're so strong and so inspiring, but they'll never be the same. For them, that's it. They had a son and now he's gone. He can be a source of inspiration for us, but for them, he's their beloved son and he's gone forever. what I'm trying, or where I'm trying to put my thoughts, where I'm trying to put my focus is not again on the loss. I'm trying to be present for this loss and then move on from it. As I said, be present, then rise. What I'm trying to believe in, or what I'm trying to dedicate myself to, is to be worthy of the sacrifice. We all have to be worthy of this sacrifice. The sacrifice happens either way, right? We can be our worst selves. It's not going to bring these boys back one way or another. But now that they died for us, now that they died to try and reestablish the terms in which we live in the geographical space where we live, now that they've been shaken and rattled by the horrific massacre of October 7th, we better be worthy of it. The kind of life we build as Jews, as Israelis, better be worthy the horrific price in blood we're paying for it time and time and time again. And that's another thing that gives me strength, because then I realize that reestablishing my daily routine, trying to help people around me, being the best version of myself that I can be, it's not just about myself. It's not just about surviving and getting through this time. It's about building a society that's worthy of its trials. And that gives me strength. That helps me focus on the Ye'ud, as Rav Soloveitchik said, the covenant of purpose, and not just the fate, not just what's happening to us all the time. The third point I want to focus on in King David's life is a point late in his life. And again, it's a point that those who've been learning with me probably heard me speak about before. We keep coming back to it in our classes, but I think we're coming back to it from a different place now. And that is the moment when, in the very last chapter of the book of Samuel, the second book of Samuel, after David counted the people, conducted a census of the people against advice and against halacha, against God's law, he is offered the choice of 3 punishments by God. God says you have to choose between 7 years of famine, 3 months of civil war, and 3 days of plague. And he chooses the plague. But when he chooses a plague, he says these words, "Sar li me'od." It is very narrow for me, really capturing this feeling that there's no way out. The world is collapsing on top of him. The walls are falling. He has 3 horrific options and nothing else to choose. And he chooses the plague, and he watches his people die. And then suddenly he rejects this feeling of narrowness, this feeling of no choice, a feeling of like, c'est la vie, better accept it, right? Accept the things you cannot change. He rejects all of that and says, but God, I sinned. I should suffer. Why should these lambs, should these sheep suffer? Speaking as a shepherd, again, going back to his roots. And I've always been fascinated by what happened between point A and point B. Point A being the point where he said, it's very narrow for me, and just accepted God's verdict. And point B being the moment where he rejected and said, no, there must be another way. And instead of just me answering, I want to open it for all of you. What do you think changed? What is it that made him capable in this moment to say, actually, no, I don't accept this? Any thoughts, guesses, possibilities? If you were in his shoes, what would have changed for you? Anyone?
I'm not clear. Could you restate it a little bit? I'm close, but I don't quite have it.
You're asking me to restate the situation?
The question.
The question. Okay, sorry. What made David, who a moment earlier, not really a moment, a day earlier, accepted God's verdict? What makes him reject God's verdict and say, no, find a different way. You shouldn't punish the people? Because a day earlier, he accepted it. He was very upset. He said it's very nerve-wracking, but he accepted it. He accepted that this is God's verdict and there's no way out. No way out. Now suddenly he's pushing back. What might have changed to lead from point A to point B? Joyce, did you want to say something?
I mean, he saw the reality of the people's suffering.
I think that's definitely part of it, that he saw, as you said, the reality of the people's suffering, that it pushed him to think beyond himself, in a sense, if I understand correctly what you're saying. It's like, it's one thing to talk in theoretical. It's another thing when you see people suffer and something about the empathy that you feel awakens you to act. Yes, and
So I think it's a combination of being faced with what he saw and recognizing, and it's me. It's my fault. I did this. I think he's a combination of this, connected to God, a man of faith. So God says, clearly he's going to accept. And then before his face, and it's my fault, he's also the model of tshuva. So his next step is, I have to do something about this. I have to change me, and changing me means protesting to God.
I think that's also very true. And it's also very, if we translate it to our situation right now, right? We feel narrow, we feel overwhelmed, we feel that the world is collapsing. How do we break away from this feeling? How do we find a way to act in the world and to make a difference? I think both of your answers, Joyce and Ann, are relevant here. Partly it's setting aside our own experience and looking at the needs of the people around us, right? Their suffering, their pain, their needs. Eleanor Roosevelt once wrote in a letter to a reader who asked her how to be more happy. She said, I'm not happy. I'm not happy. What can I do to be more happy? She said, well, maybe like set aside your unhappiness and pay more attention to other people's unhappiness and see what you can do about that. And I thought that there's something very profound about that when you see other people, and you need to allow yourself to see them and not be focused on yourself. I'm talking to myself as well. When you allow yourself to see other people, it inspires you out of that place of passivity. But also, and I'll get to you in a second, just a moment. What Anne said also, the serenity prayer. God, give me the courage to change the things I can change, the acceptance to accept. Is that how you say it? The things I can change, and the wisdom to distinguish between the two. And at first, David thinks that it's a reality that's beyond his ability to change. And then he's like, wait a minute, but it's something about me and my relationship with God. And that's also a very powerful thing, that when we just look at the horrific things happening around us, it induces a certain passivity because there's really nothing we can do about it. But instead, we can focus on what we can do to change. What can I do to make more light in the world today? I find that very empowering as I try and get myself out of the funk and into a place of action. Marianne, and then I saw Amy also, but Marianne and then Amy, okay?
So it reminds me very much of the relationship between Abraham and God, especially around Sodom. And I think this is not very well thought through, but I think that that relationship between God and Abraham in those moments was God as a teacher. God had determined that Moshe was going to be his representative in all the world, and etc. And Abraham took it as a teachable moment. And that empowered him for himself and also in his relationship with God, and also as an example to Lot. So I think that's what it reminds me of, a teachable moment that David realizes was a teachable moment inside himself. Yes, he had done something wrong, but he had learned from it. And
there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying. I'm not going to do all of it. I just want to touch upon something in the end when you say about the learning from it. I think that that's definitely something we're experiencing right now. I feel like, some people say, oh, don't listen to any of the stories, don't read any of the, testimonies. And everybody should do what's right for them personally. Like everybody should manage their soul's needs. I think there is some value though in looking into the eyes of the horror that happened, but only to the extent that we're learning something for ourselves. And once we learn it, we should look forward and act upon it, not to leave it as like this ongoing like morass of contemplation. So I'm not touching a lot of what you said, but I think that's a really important point. So thank you, Amy, and then Naomi Baryam. Yes, Amy.
Okay, so I think that, you know, also, and it's so telling that this happens on well, in Israel, Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah, and everything. And also, what we just read was Kohelet, and how we learn in Kohelet, there's a time to mourn, there's a time to grieve, there's a time to get up, there's a time to heal, there's a time to kill. And I think, you know, David had this emotional, strong connection with Hashem, and I think that's why Hashem picked him, because he realized that you don't just wallow in one place. There's a time for this, there's a time for that. You don't just stay in one place. You go according to the time, and we have to do that too. Yeah, there's a time to feel sorry for poor Palestinians who are put in a bad place. There's a time to stand up for yourself. There's a time to kill. There's a time to heal, and to understand that, and to recognize that.
I think that's very true, and I think it's you're touching upon a very deep psychological truth here, also for all of us. I think, namely that there's seasons in emotional life. And there's also seasons in a nation's emotional life. And just as David kind of moved from the season of acceptance to a season of defiance in his conversation with God, of first he accepts everything and says, wait a minute, no, I don't accept it. So we move from mourning to defiance to determination, and often back and over and over and over again as we go through these days, and to make room for that, but also not to get stuck. So thank you for raising that, Naomi, Stephanie, and then we'll have to start wrapping it up together. Yes, Naomi.
So a lot of thoughts today, but just what you're talking about in terms of, you know, accept the things I cannot change. And I think what we're talking about, I read recently, a meme kind of thing. I think it was attributed to Angela Davis, but I'm not sure I'm remembering that right. That she said, I'm no longer happy with accept the things I cannot change. I need to change the things I cannot accept.
Yeah.
And I think part of what we're talking about is indeed, in each in our own way, changing the things we cannot accept.
I think that's very true. I mean, I think of it in terms of, national policy. So I think also national policy is not in my hands right now. What is in my hands is what I demand. And I think that we need to stop shortchanging ourselves in what we demand, and kind of saying, oh, we should accept it. No. When the war is over, when it's time to reestablish who we are, we have to be very clear on this. And also, but again, bringing it to what's in our hands right now, what's within our sphere of influence right now. It's a time for action. It's a season of action. It's a season to do. It's not a season to sit and think and wonder. I mean, also that, but we're called upon to do. We're called upon to do. And acceptance can be a trap right now, can be a delusion, something attractive that can let us rest, but we need to do. So thank you, Naomi. Stephanie.
Yes, I just wanted to say, and in some ways this is an echo, both of the comment about Avraham and the comment about Kohelet. The Avraham story he goes down from 50 to 20 to 10, whatever, doesn't really end. It's kind of like he's trying to figure out where he can play a role in some of this. At what point must he challenge the injustice of what seems to be the injustice of the world? And at what point does he need to think about what he might be able to do? And these things that have happened, and we may never figure out the why, in the sense of ultimate causality or what could have been done before, but we can move forward and find a little thing or a big thing, depending on our places, that might be able to make an improvement going forward. And that challenging the injustice of situations and seeing what you can do to move forward to a better place seems to be a very Jewish role.
Yeah, and I think it's thank you, Stephanie. I think it's tied to the idea of choosing life. You know, we have this strong statement in Deuteronomy that Moshe in his speech says, I put before you today the life and death, the good and evil, choose life, right? And I feel like, I mean, it's easy to say life and death, choose life. Of course, I want to live, but I think it means also that. I think it means looking forward and not looking backwards, because ultimately, like I said, we should look backwards to learn something, to be present with the feelings of lamentation. But ultimately, life isn't there. Life is there. Life is in the forward motion. Life is what are we doing with it? And that brings us back to the question of a covenant. Which covenant are we inhabiting? Are we inhabiting just the covenant of faith, which is all about how people see us as Jews, kill us, hurt us, cut off our hand, and leave us to bleed to death, like in this horrible story that Lenore Atias shared? Or are we constantly and actively and through every moment and every step we take, choose a covenant of Ye'ud, of purpose? And with that, I want to, I know that we're short on time, so I'll just one last thought to kind of bring it together. When my father was in prison, but before his sentencing, when he was in the interrogation, for a year and a half, he was in prison being interrogated as his captors, as the Soviet Union was building the case against him. And they kept trying to break him. What they wanted was for him to say, I recant in some public way. Yeah, Zionism is no good. Actually, Russia is the best place to be. And they kept trying to both scare him by telling him they'll kill him otherwise, and tempt him by saying, oh, you're young, you have a beautiful young wife. Recant, we'll let you go off with a slap on the wrist. You can reunite with your wife. Don't you want that? Of course he wanted that. And at some point they brought up the example of Galileo Galilei. They said, look, you're a scientist, you admire Galileo Galilei, right? When Galileo Galilei was persecuted by the Inquisition, he recanted his opinions about whether the sun goes around the earth or the earth around the sun, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into that. But he, even though he knew one thing to be true, he said the other was true to appease his captors. And they let him go. And he was able to keep doing science for the rest of his life and leave great discoveries. And of course, his truth was, triumphant in the end. But if he would have been a martyr for it, then all of his other life's achievement would have not have happened. So don't you want to be like Galileo Galilei? You have a truth. Pretend to disown it. In a few years, you'll be in Israel with your wife, make a press release and say, actually, I still stand behind it. I was just forced to say so in order to survive. Why be a hero? Why be a martyr? Look to Galileo Galilei. If he was willing to, kind of compromise to survive, shouldn't you? And that was a hard blow because my father did look up to Galileo Galilei. And for a second, it did make sense. Why not? Why not just lie now and then tell the truth later when you're free and safe and with your wife in Israel? But then he realized that the answer is hidden inside the question, so to speak, because here he is hundreds of years later, and the fact that Galileo Galilei didn't have the courage to stand up for truth is used to weaken his will in his cell. And he called it, in a letter to my mother that he wrote from prison, he called it the connection of souls. All souls are connected. And when one soul compromises on truth, that can weaken other souls, other people in the same place, in the same position. And the remarkable thing, he said, is that it works also the other way around. Obviously, Galileo Galilei couldn't care less that my father exists or doesn't exist because he's dead. But in a sense, what we do now changes the meaning of the story of the people who came before us. In other words, if my dad would have broken and recanted, Galileo Galilei's story would have went on to create bad things in the world. meaning it would have successfully been used to break others people's spirits. Whereas by saying no, my dad also changed the meaning of the past. And he said, what was is not what shall be. That's a slightly abstract example. Think more concretely. If we give up now and sink into despair and just let our enemies define the story, what does it do to the achievement of the 48 warriors, the 67 warriors, the 73 warriors who fought for us? What does it do to their achievements if we let our story become a story of tragedy and decline? We have to win now, not just for our sake. We have to win now so that their achievements mean something in the long run. So that the fact that Jewish mothers were able to pass on Jewish practices in unbelievable conditions for generations, by us keeping those same practices, we are giving meaning to their efforts. We are their victory all those generations later. And in that regard, when I think about that, we're not in a cell. We're here, you know, you're where you are and I'm where I am, but we're not in a cell. We're not imprisoned. And yet all of us still face a similar choice. The way we behave right now affects other beyond ourselves. It will affect the previous generations, because if we behave with royal garb and rise and heroically build our lives and fight for our country and for our people in wherever arena we are in, then we are adding a layer to the stories that came before us. We're turning them into the inspiration for a glorious future, the one another step in a glorious ascent. Well, if we break down, we kind of diminish them, their lasting power. We change and affect the people around us right now in the present, because when I'm keeping my spirits high, I'm keeping my children's spirits high, I'm keeping my community's spirits high. Whereas when I just cry and cry, I also get other people to feel sad around me. And that means that every choice I make now means something beyond the self. And we change the story and the meaning for next generation, because one day our kids will remember this time, our grandkids, our great-grandkids, they will remember this time. And it's in our hands right now to determine, every single one of us, to determine whether when they look back, they're like, oh yeah, and then it was so tragic and our enemies did such bad things to us and it was terrible. Or they're like, yeah, we underwent a horrible loss, and then look how we rose, look how we helped each other, look how we held hands together and grew out of it as a people, as a nation, as a country. So when I think about that, and this takes us all the way back to the beginning, to the question of how to find strength, it takes us to that historical perspective. That in this historical perspective, when we think about what the little things I make today, the little choices I make today about being present yet rising above it and being more than that, they affect the meaning of the past, they affect the people around me in the present, and they affect the story that we will tell our children and they will tell our children one day. And in that I find a lot of strength. And may we strengthen each other, may we hold each other's hand, and may we see this through to a better version of our nation, of our country, of ourselves, God willing.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Amen.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rachel.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you all.
May we hear good
That
news.
was- Thank you.